The morning sun hit the streets of downtown Atlanta with a warm, golden haze, but the calm didn't last long. The hum of city life, honking horns, the chatter of people, the rush of morning traffic was broken by the sharp screech of tires. It was a quiet intersection near Auburn Avenue, an old part of town that carried memories of history and pain, where every brick seemed to whisper something about the past. The kind of place that never truly forgot where it came from. On that Friday morning, a silver Mercedes eased to a stop at a red light. Behind the wheel sat an elderly man, calm, his back straight, his face composed. His hair was grey but neat. His eyes focused on the road ahead. He wore a dark suit that looked pressed even after hours of sitting, the kind of man who carried discipline in every small gesture. To anyone passing by, he looked like someone's grandfather, maybe retired, maybe heading to a morning appointment. Nothing about him drew attention. A few cars behind, a police cruiser idled, its driver tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, eyes narrowing at the vehicle in front. Officer Daniel Reeves was in his mid-30s, built broad, his face sunburned from long hours under the Georgia sun. He'd been with the force for nearly a decade, but he still carried a chip on his shoulder. He often told himself he was keeping the city safe, but deep down, there was something restless in him, an anger that never seemed to fade. Maybe it was the long shifts, maybe it was frustration with the people he dealt with, or maybe it was something uglier that had grown inside him without him realizing it. Reeves watched the Mercedes carefully. The car looked too clean, too new, and something about the driver, an older black man in a suit, didn't sit right with him. He didn't know why, or maybe he did. He told himself it was instinct. That's what he always called it, instinct.
But it wasn't instinct. It was bias, deep and quiet, hidden under years of excuses. The light turned green, and the Mercedes rolled forward smoothly. Reeves followed, keeping a short distance. He checked the license plate, his eyes flicking to the computer mounted beside him. No violations, no alerts. Still he stayed behind. Something about the way the car moved, steady and unbothered, seemed to irritate him more. The driver, unaware of the growing attention behind him, continued calmly, the radio softly playing a jazz tune. He liked jazz, always had. It reminded him of long nights studying in cramped rooms decades ago, the music helping him think. Today, he was headed to a meeting at the courthouse. A long day of hearings waited for him, but he didn't mind. Work had always been his refuge. In that courtroom, he found order, reason, justice. At least that's what he liked to believe. As the two cars turned onto a quieter street lined with old oak trees, the sound of the siren suddenly broke the calm. A sharp burst of noise echoed between the buildings. The old man looked into his rear-view mirror, confused for a second, then saw the flashing blue lights. His eyebrows lifted slightly. He slowed, guiding his car to the side of the road, calm and steady. He'd done nothing wrong, and he knew it. Reeves stepped out of his cruiser with the kind of confidence that came from authority and years of unchallenged behavior. He adjusted his belt, hand resting near his holster, and walked toward the car. The morning air was still, but tension began to grow like heat before a storm. The driver lowered his window halfway, polite and patient. Reeves didn't see a respected man of the law sitting in front of him. He saw only what he expected to see, another black man behind the wheel of a luxury car that didn't belong. "License and registration," Reeves said flatly, eyes narrow. The old man reached slowly for his wallet. "May I ask what this is about, officer?" His voice was calm, deep and careful, the way someone speaks when they've spent a lifetime choosing their words. "You were driving suspiciously," Reeves replied, though he knew how weak it sounded. The old man blinked once, then handed over his license without a word. His hands didn't shake, but there was a weight in his expression, something like disappointment, not fear. Reeves took the license and glanced at it. The name printed there meant nothing to him at first. He was too focused on the color of the man's skin, the tone of his voice, the way he held himself. Reeves thought he was dealing with arrogance. What he was really seeing was dignity. Behind that calm, though, the old man felt something familiar rising in him, a quiet sadness. He had lived long enough to know this kind of encounter too well. No matter what title he carried, what courtroom he sat in, what words were written before his name, to some people, he would always be seen the same way. Cars passed slowly, drivers glancing curiously at the scene. To them, it looked ordinary. Just another traffic stop, but there was nothing ordinary about it. Inside the police cruiser, the computer screen blinked, processing the license information. When the name F.S. inly appeared, Reeves frowned. It didn't make sense. He blinked again, rereading it, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered in his chest. He turned toward the man sitting patiently in the car, his face unreadable. The quiet stretched between them. The old man simply looked back, waiting. Not angry, not defiant, but steady. His voice, when he finally spoke again, carried the weight of years, of battles fought in courtrooms and beyond. "Is there a problem, officer?" Reeves didn't answer right away. He looked down at the name again. Justice Harold M. Carter, one of the longest-serving members of the Supreme Court of the United States. And suddenly, the silence felt heavy enough to crush the air between them. But in that single moment, before the truth would settle and reputations would unravel, the world still hung in fragile balance, the kind that can only exist right before everything breaks. The silence that followed that moment was almost unbearable. Officer Reeves stood stiff beside the silver Mercedes, his fingers gripping the edge of the license plate like he was holding onto a live wire. The name burned in his mind. Justice Harold M. Carter. He wasn't just anyone. He was that Harold Carter. The man whose rulings had been on national news. The man who had sat on panels about equality and civil rights. The man whose face had appeared in photographs, shaking hands with presidents. Reeves felt his throat dry up, his pulse suddenly heavy in his neck. He glanced toward the open window again, where Justice Carter waited quietly, the calm in his expression now replaced by something harder to define. Disappointment, maybe. Or quiet anger. "Everything all right, officer?" Carter asked, his voice low but steady. Reeves forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, sir. Just running your info." But he wasn't all right. Something inside him twisted in that moment. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was shame mixed with fear. And beneath that, a defensive pride that began to boil. He could already imagine the headlines if this went wrong. A white cop harasses a black Supreme Court justice. His career would be done. His badge, his reputation, his entire identity, gone. He walked back to his cruiser, pretending to stay professional, but his mind was racing. He wanted to fix this before it blew up. But how? He thought about just letting the justice go, apologizing, maybe pretending it was a mistake. But the thought of apologizing made him burn inside. To him, it felt like surrender, like weakness. Carter sat silently in his car, watching Reeves through the side mirror. He'd seen this kind of moment before, when pride meets consequence. It was the same thing he'd seen in courtrooms for years, men trying to justify wrongs by burying them in excuses. He didn't hate Reeves. He pitied him. But pity has a way of cutting deeper than anger, and Reeves felt it, even if Carter didn't say a word. When Reeves returned to the car, he cleared his throat. "You can go, sir," he said quietly. Carter looked at him for a long second, then nodded once. "Thank you, officer." He rolled his window up and pulled away slowly,
the Mercedes gliding back into traffic, leaving Reeves standing on the side of the road with the sound of the siren still echoing faintly in the air. For most people, that would have been the end. A mistake made, a lesson learned. But something about the encounter stuck in Reeves's mind like a thorn. Later that night, sitting in his apartment, he replayed the moment again and again, the way Carter had looked at him, the calm, knowing expression, the quiet confidence. It gnawed at him. He told himself it wasn't about race, it was about respect. That man had looked down on him, treated him like he was nothing, like his badge didn't mean a thing. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. What really bothered him was how small he had felt. At the same time, the story of the traffic stop began to spread, first among officers in the precinct, then across social media. Someone had recorded part of it on their phone, just a few seconds of the stop, but it was enough. The video showed Reeves standing beside the Mercedes, hand on his gun, the justice's calm voice asking, "Is there a problem, officer?" That single question was all people needed. By morning, news channels were talking about it. Racial profiling or misunderstanding, the headline said. The department tried to keep it quiet, but it was too late. The footage had gone viral. Reeves was placed on leave, pending investigation. He was told it was temporary, just procedure. But everyone in the station knew what that meant. His captain barely looked him in the eye. His co-workers gave short, pitying glances. He spent his days sitting in his dark apartment, blinds drawn, the TV playing endless coverage of his own face. Talk shows discussed him like he weren't a real person. Protesters marched outside the station. His family stopped answering his calls. Even his friends began to pull away. That's when the resentment began to fester. Carter, meanwhile, tried to stay out of the public noise. He refused interviews. He didn't want to turn it into a spectacle. For him, it was a sad reminder that the world he had spent his life trying to make fair was still broken. But privately, he couldn't shake the unease that had followed him since that day. The look in that officer's eyes, it wasn't just anger, it was something colder. Over the next few weeks, things grew worse. Reeves started drinking heavily. He read every article, every comment, every insult thrown his way. Racist cop. Power abuser. Coward. The words burned into him until they became part of him. He convinced himself that he was the victim, that he had been set up, humiliated by a man who thought he was better than him. Late one night, in his half-lit apartment, Reeves began searching for everything he could about Justice Carter. He watched old interviews, speeches and rulings. He studied his face, his voice, his mannerisms. What started as curiosity turned into fixation. He wanted to understand the man who had ruined his life, or at least, that's what he told himself. He found Carter's home address easily. Public records, property listings, even Google Maps. Nothing was hidden from someone who wanted to look. The justice lived in a quiet neighborhood outside the city, a place of trimmed lawns and still evenings. Reeves drove there one night, parking a few houses away. He sat in his car for hours, lights off, engine quiet. Through the window, he could see the faint glow from the justice's study upstairs. Sometimes the shadow of Carter's figure moved past the window. Reeves wasn't sure what he wanted. Maybe just to see him, to face him again. Maybe to make him understand what he'd done. But the longer he sat there, the more the line between understanding and obsession blurred. Meanwhile, inside the house, Carter's wife noticed strange things. Cars idling too long outside, unfamiliar figures walking by at night. She told him to call someone to report it, but he brushed it off. He didn't want to seem paranoid, especially now, when people were already watching his every move. At work, Carter tried to focus on his cases, but the attention hadn't died down. Protesters still gathered outside the courthouse, some supporting him, others accusing him of using his position to humiliate the police. What had started as a clear issue of justice now felt tangled in politics, anger, and noise. the while, Reeves kept driving by the house, every night. The obsession turned darker when he lost his job officially. The department released a statement saying that his actions had failed to reflect the integrity of the force. That was the final blow. He had nothing left. No badge, no paycheck, no respect. Something snapped. He started talking to people online, in anonymous forums where others vented their anger about reverse racism and corrupt elites. They fueled his bitterness, validating his pain. They told him he was right, that the system had turned against good men like him. The anger grew into something else, something dangerous. He began keeping a notebook, filled with names, dates, and notes about the justice's schedule. When he followed Carter's car one morning, he noticed the same calmness as before, the same quiet confidence. It only enraged him more. How could this man go on like nothing had happened, like he hadn't destroyed another life? Meanwhile, Carter's unease grew. He started noticing the same black sedan in his mirror more often, once at the grocery store, once outside the courthouse, once again near his home. He mentioned it to his security detail, but they assured him it was nothing. Still, he couldn't sleep well anymore. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside made him tense. He tried to focus on work, but his mind kept drifting back to that morning, to the siren, to the officer's eyes. Both men were spiraling, one from guilt and the other from obsession. Their lives had become tangled in a way neither could undo. The system that should have protected both of them had failed, and now all that remained was anger, fear, and pride. As the days stretched into weeks, their paths kept crossing, at protests, in passing glances, in the whispers of media reports. Reeves was always watching, waiting, unseen but near. And in that quiet, dangerous space between them, the tension built like a fuse waiting for a spark. Neither of them knew it yet, but the moment that would change both of their lives forever was already coming. All it needed was one wrong step, one bad night, one moment when the weight of everything finally collapsed. The night it happened was cold and heavy, the kind of night that felt too quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The rain had started just after sunset, thin and steady, blurring the glow of streetlights and washing the world in grey. Justice Harold Carter sat alone in his study, the light from a single lamp spilling across stacks of papers. The clock on the wall ticked softly, filling the silence that had become far too familiar these past few weeks. He had stayed late at the courthouse that day, preparing for a new case that touched too close to the themes that haunted him: racial profiling, systemic bias, the same ghosts that had followed him since that morning with Officer Reeves. He thought he had buried the memory of that day, but it never truly left him. It stayed quiet during the day, only to rise at night, when the house grew still, and the shadows felt like they were watching. Outside, a car rolled slowly to a stop across the street. The headlights dimmed. Inside, Daniel Reeves sat gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. His hands trembled, but not from cold. From something else. Something that had been building for weeks. Anger, humiliation, the sick feeling that his life had been stolen from him by the man inside that house. He had told himself 1,000 times that he wasn't going to do anything. He'd just watch, maybe confront him, maybe demand an apology, something to make the world make sense again. But that was a lie he could no longer keep up. The gun resting in the passenger seat wasn't for words. He looked up at the house, rain streaking down his windshield. Through the window, he saw the soft light of the study, the silhouette of the man who had everything. He didn't respect power or control. A man who had destroyed him with a look. He whispered under his breath, "You did this to me." Inside, Carter's wife had already gone to bed. He told her he'd be up soon, He needed time to think, to read, to distract himself from the feeling that someone was always watching. The past few nights, he had thought about hiring private security again, but pride stopped him. He didn't want to live in fear. He had spent his entire life standing up to fear. Down the street, Reeves stepped out of his car. The rain soaked him instantly, but he didn't care. He tucked the gun into his jacket and started walking. Each step felt like something pulling him deeper into a tunnel he couldn't climb out of. His mind was loud, full of the voices that had followed him for weeks, news anchors, online comments, the echo of Carter's calm voice asking, "Is there a problem, officer?" By the time he reached the gate, he was trembling so hard it was hard to breathe. He looked around. The street was empty, just the sound of rain against the pavement. He pushed through the gate and moved toward the house. The front porch light flicked on with a motion sensor. His heart leaped, but he kept going. Carter heard it too. The faint creak outside, the crunch of shoes on wet gravel. He froze. The sound was out of place. Not thunder, not rain. Footsteps. Slow, heavy ones. He stood, his eyes flicking toward the window. For a second, he saw nothing. Then a shadow moved past the glass. He felt his chest tighten. He turned off the lamp and stood in the darkness, listening. The sound came again, closer now, this time from the front door. A single knock. Firm. He waited. Another knock. Harder. Carter moved slowly to the door, voice low and steady. "Who's there?" No answer. He felt that same quiet dread from the day on the road, the same heaviness behind the silence. He reached for the phone but stopped halfway. He didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe... The door shook with a sudden violent bang. Carter's wife called from upstairs, startled. "Harold?" Before he could answer, the door burst open. Reeves stood there, drenched, eyes wild, gun in his hand. For a moment both men froze. The rain pounded against the doorway. The lamp flickered back to life as Carter reached for it, his hand shaking just enough to show the fear he tried to hide. "Officer Reeves," he said quietly, recognizing him instantly. His voice stayed calm, though every instinct told him to run. "You need to leave." Reeves stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "You ruined my life," he said, his voice cracking. "You think you're better than me. You sit up there in your big house, your fancy car, and everyone bows down to you. But you destroyed me." Carter kept his hands visible, speaking softly, the way he had when calming witnesses, when diffusing tension in the courtroom. "I didn't destroy you. You did something wrong, and you're facing the result of it. You still have a choice now. You can—" "Don't tell me what I can do," Reeves shouted, his voice echoing through the house. Upstairs, Carter's wife screamed his name, her footsteps pounding as she tried to come down. "Stay upstairs!" he yelled back, his composure breaking for the first time. The air between them grew heavy, the sound of rain mixing with the sharp breaths of two men who had both lost control of their lives in different ways. Reeves lifted the gun, his hands trembling. "You made me a monster," he whispered. "You and your kind." Carter's eyes softened, not with fear, but with something else. Sorrow. "No, son," he said quietly. "You made yourself one." For a moment, something flickered in Reeves's eyes. Hesitation, maybe guilt. A flash of the person he might have been before bitterness took over. But it was gone just as quickly. The gun went off. The sound cracked through the night, louder than thunder. Carter stumbled back, a hand pressed to his chest, confusion flashing across his face as he sank into the chair behind him. His wife's scream tore through the silence. Reeves stood frozen, the gun still raised, his breathing ragged. The smell of gunpowder filled the room, sharp and metallic. The justice's papers fluttered off the desk, drifting to the floor, each one stained as blood began to spread across the rug. For a long moment, Reeves couldn't move. He didn't feel victory or relief, only a hollow shock that swallowed him whole. He had imagined this moment so many times, but in reality, it felt meaningless. Carter looked up at him, eyes dimming, his voice a whisper. "Why?" Reeves opened his mouth, but no words came. He dropped the gun, the clatter echoing through the room. Panic finally took hold. He turned and ran, the rain swallowing his footsteps as he disappeared into the night. Inside, Carter's wife knelt beside her husband, her trembling hands trying to stop the bleeding that couldn't be stopped. His breathing came in short, shallow gasps, his eyes fixed on something far away. "Stay with me," she pleaded, pressing against his wound. "Please, Harold, stay with me." But he couldn't. The last sound he heard was the rain outside, and the faint echo of his wife's voice fading into the distance. Outside, Reeves stumbled into his car, soaked, shaking. He could barely see through the rain. His reflection in the rearview mirror looked like a stranger, eyes wild, face pale, mouth trembling. He started the engine, hands slipping on the steering wheel. His thoughts were a blur. He drove with no direction, only speed, heart pounding in his ears. Every light he passed seemed to flash red. Every siren in the distance felt like it was coming for him. He pulled over on an empty road, gasping for breath, the reality of what he'd done beginning to sink in. His hands were covered in blood. Not Carter's, but his own, from gripping the gun so hard that the metal had cut his palm. He thought about turning himself in, about calling someone, about ending it all right there, but all he could do was stare into the rain, whispering the same words over and over. "I didn't mean to." But he had. Back at the house, the sirens finally came. Blue and red lights danced across the wet pavement, flashing against the old brick walls. Neighbors gathered under umbrellas, whispering in disbelief. The story was already spreading, even before the body was carried out. The justice who once stood for fairness and truth lay still, while the man who took everything from him vanished into the storm. And in that moment, the rain didn't feel like cleansing anymore. It felt like mourning. The morning after the shooting, the rain still hadn't stopped. The grey sky hung low over the city, and the world seemed slower, quieter, as if it was still trying to understand what had happened. Outside the Carter home, police cars lined the street. The flashing lights had faded, replaced by the dull hum of conversation and the quiet sobs of neighbors standing under umbrellas. Inside, the house felt frozen in time. The living room was still scattered with papers, the justice's chair still pulled back, the faint metallic smell of blood lingering in the air. His wife sat wrapped in a blanket, her face pale and hollow. She had stopped crying hours ago. Her tears had dried into a blank, distant stare. The detectives moved carefully, their voices low, their eyes heavy. Even they seemed to know they were standing in the middle of something larger than a single crime. News of Justice Harold Carter's death spread like wildfire. Within hours, every major network carried the story. The headlines were blunt. Supreme Court Justice shot dead in his home. Photos of him, smiling at court hearings, shaking hands with world leaders, flashed across every screen. His life's work was suddenly reduced to a single moment of tragedy. For millions of people who had admired him, it felt like a personal loss. He had been a symbol of fairness and dignity, a man who had spent decades fighting for equality. Vigils began outside courthouses. Crowds gathered with candles, holding signs that read, "Justice for Justice Carter." But not everyone reacted with mourning. Online, the same dark corners that had fueled Reeves's anger were buzzing with twisted celebration. Some called it karma,
Others claimed it was proof that even powerful men couldn't escape judgment. Lies spread faster than facts, rumors that the justice had provoked the attack, or that the story was being covered up. Meanwhile, Reeves had gone missing. His car was found abandoned 2 towns over, empty, the gun gone. Inside were a few crumpled papers, court summonses, unpaid bills, and the disciplinary letter that had ended his career. The police issued a nationwide alert, but it was as if he had disappeared into thin air. His family was left to face the fallout. His ex-wife refused to speak to the press. His younger brother, a teacher, broke down in front of cameras saying, "Danny wasn't a monster, he just lost himself." But no one wanted to hear excuses. The world had already decided what kind of man he was. Days passed, and the shock gave way to anger. The public wanted answers. How could a man who once carried a badge turn into a killer? How did no one see it coming? Inside the justice's home, grief turned into something quieter, but deeper. His wife avoided reporters, avoiding the questions that all sounded the same. Instead, she spent her days in his study, staring at the chair where he had taken his last breath. The house was full of reminders, the smell of his cologne, his glasses still resting on the desk, his half-read books. But what hurt most wasn't what was left behind. It was what he never got to finish. The nation mourned him as a hero, but to her, he was just a man. Her husband, the one who still made her coffee every morning, who left his shoes by the door. She couldn't think of him as an idea. She could only remember his hand going cold in hers. A week later, they found Reeves. It was a fisherman who saw the body first, half hidden near the riverbank, caught between the roots of a tree. The police arrived quickly, and though the body was badly weathered from the rain, there was no doubt who it was. His service pistol was nearby, and the conclusion was simple: suicide. The news brought a strange kind of silence. For some, it was closure. For others, it felt hollow. There would be no trial, no confession, no real answers. Just another tragedy layered on top of the first. In the days that followed, the media painted 2 different stories. One about a fallen hero, a justice who had devoted his life to truth, and another about a broken man consumed by hate. Both stories were true in their own way, but neither told the whole truth about how such things happen. Slowly, quietly, like a crack spreading through glass, the department issued a formal apology to the Carter family. It sounded rehearsed, full of official language about policy reform and institutional accountability. But for those who knew Reeves, it didn't bring peace. His old partner, Officer Bennett, couldn't stop thinking about him. He'd worked beside Reeves for years, seen the frustration, the bitterness building up. He was angry at everything, Bennett told an investigator, but we all thought it would pass. We always think it'll pass. In the courthouse, Carter's empty seat became a symbol. A black ribbon was tied around his chair, and his colleagues spoke about his legacy, the rulings he'd written, the fights he'd taken on, the calm strength he brought into every room. But behind the speeches was an unspoken truth. His death had reopened wounds the country had tried to heal. Talk shows debated endlessly about what the tragedy meant. Some said it proved that hate was still alive in the system. Others said it showed how society abandoned the broken. Both were right in different ways, but lost in the noise were the 2 people at the center of it all, men who had once been strangers, now bound together by violence neither could undo. For Carter's wife, grief became routine. She stopped reading the news, stopped answering calls. Sometimes she sat in the garden where he liked to drink his morning tea. She could still hear his voice in the quiet moments, soft and reassuring. She wanted to hate the man who took him from her, but she couldn't. Hatred felt too small for something so big. All she could feel was sadness, for both of them. Months later, when the city held a memorial in his honor, thousands attended. The courthouse steps were covered in flowers and candles.
People spoke about justice and forgiveness, about the dangers of hate and pride. But when his wife took the stage, she didn't talk about the law. She
cared about fear. Fear, she said, her voice steady, is what destroyed them both. One feared losing power. The other feared what power could never fix. And fear, she paused, her eyes sweeping across the crowd, is what will destroy us if we don't learn from it. Her words were quiet, but they stayed. Afterward, the story began to fade from the headlines. Another scandal, another crisis took its place. The world moved on, as it always does. But the scar remained, in the family, in the community, in the quiet spaces of people's minds where trust had once lived. In the end, there were no winners. Reeves was gone. Carter was gone. One man's anger had destroyed 2 lives and left a country questioning how something like this could still happen. And yet, even after everything, on certain nights when the rain fell just right and the world seemed still, people passing by the Carter home swore they could see a faint light glowing from the study window, like a man who refused to let his final moment be the last thing the world remembered about him. In the months following the deaths of Justice Harold Carter and Daniel Reeves, the world struggled to make sense of what had happened. Time dulled the noise of outrage, but it did not erase the questions that lingered in the air. Questions about justice, about failure, about what drives ordinary men to extraordinary violence. There were no court hearings, no televised trials, no confessions from a witness stand. Both men had been silenced, one by another's hand, the other by his own. And yet the nation still sought accountability. People wanted someone to blame, the police for missing the warning signs, the government for ignoring mental health crises among veterans, or the system that created men like Reeves in the first place. But there was no single answer, only fragments of truth, scattered among grief and disbelief. For the Carter family, life after the funeral was a quiet ache. The justice's wife sold their home in the spring, unable to bear the weight of memories that lived in every room. She moved to a smaller apartment in the city, where no one recognized her in the grocery store. Some saw that as retreat, but for her, it was survival. Every morning, she placed fresh flowers near his photograph, a simple habit that kept her anchored to something human. She'd long since stopped appearing in public, though occasionally she'd send letters to advocacy groups working on judicial reform or public safety policy. Her words were calm, measured, the way her husband's had been, but there was always one recurring line in her letters: justice without empathy becomes cruelty. The justice's legacy endured in the legal world. His final rulings, once controversial, were now studied in law schools as examples of moral clarity. His name was etched into a courthouse plaque, and an annual lecture was established in his honor. But even as the tributes piled up, the tragedy behind his death became a kind of moral riddle. Students debated whether his idealism had blinded him to the dangers that lurked outside the law, or if it was proof that conviction, no matter the cost, still mattered. Meanwhile, Daniel Reeves's name vanished into the footnotes of the story. His grave was unmarked for months, until his brother placed a small stone there himself. It read simply, "Daniel Reeves, 1972-2025. May he find the peace he couldn't find here." For Reeves's family, life became an exercise in quiet endurance. His brother faced harassment online, his students whispering behind his back. To many, Reeves was the embodiment of betrayal, a man who'd turned against the very justice he once served. But to those who had known him personally, the tragedy wasn't just his crime, it was the years of silence that led to it. In the months following the case, the department launched an internal investigation into Reeves's background. It revealed a familiar story: disciplinary issues, untreated PTSD, financial troubles, and isolation. A pattern ignored because no one wanted to confront what it meant, that a man sworn to protect the law
could also be corroded by it. The findings led to new reforms: mandatory counseling programs, early intervention systems, and peer check-ins for officers showing signs of mental distress. It was progress, but it came too late for the men already buried. As the public conversation shifted, the case became more than just a tragedy. It became a mirror, reflecting the fault lines of the nation's conscience. Commentators argued that the murder was not born from one man's madness, but from a slow erosion of empathy, a society that pushed people to breaking points and then feigned surprise when they shattered. The media, once eager to sensationalize, began to explore the deeper implications. Documentaries framed the case as a study in moral collapse: the respected justice who embodied law and reason, and the disgraced officer who felt betrayed by both. In their opposing trajectories lay a haunting symmetry. Each man had spent his life devoted to justice, and yet both became victims of it in different ways. Years later, when scholars revisited the case, they often spoke about the two kinds of justice it represented: the justice of law and the justice of feeling. Harold Carter lived by the former, unwavering even when compassion might have softened his verdicts. Daniel Reeves lived by the latter, ruled by resentment, by his belief that emotion and fairness should be the same thing. Both extremes, it seemed, led to destruction. This duality fascinated the public because it spoke to something deeply human: the conflict between morality and vengeance, between righteousness and empathy. The tragedy forced people to look inward and ask uncomfortable questions. How much anger do we carry quietly each day? How easily could it twist into hate if left unchallenged? And when we cry out for justice, what do we truly mean? Fairness or revenge? In the legal community, Carter's death became a turning point in discussions about the safety and visibility of public officials. Laws were proposed to protect judges and their families, though critics argued it was a bandage over a much deeper wound. Others pointed out that until systemic mistrust was addressed within police forces, courts, and the public, the cycle would repeat. But for the families involved, the debate didn't matter. The losses were personal, not political. The justice's wife lived out her days quietly, turning down interviews and foundations named in his memory. Reeves's brother moved to another state, starting over, where no one knew his name. Neither family ever met, though there were moments when their paths almost crossed. Once, during a televised memorial, the justice's wife mentioned forgiveness. She didn't say Reeves's name, but everyone knew who she meant. It wasn't absolution, it was acknowledgement. Her voice trembled as she said, "Anger can build walls around grief, but forgiveness, however fragile, is the only way out. Oh, live with what's left." Those words rippled through the audience, sparking new discussions. Could forgiveness coexist with justice? Was it possible to mourn both the victim and the perpetrator? It was a question without an answer, but it showed the wound had begun to heal in small, unseen ways. By the second anniversary of the tragedy, the story had largely faded from public memory. Yet for those who lived through it, the echoes remained. Law students still cited Carter's rulings. Activists still referenced Reeves's breakdown as a cautionary tale. The rain that had fallen the night of the murder had long since stopped, but its residue, fear, guilt, reflection, lingered in quiet corners of the country's consciousness. If there was one lesson the story left behind, it was this: justice is not a fixed thing. It is fragile, human, and often flawed. It demands not only order, but understanding, not just punishment, but compassion. Carter had believed in the letter of the law. Reeves had believed in his personal sense of justice. Both were right in their own eyes, and both were wrong in the ways that mattered most. In the end, their lives became warnings of what happens when justice loses balance. When one man places faith entirely in reason, and another entirely in rage, humanity disappears between them. Years later, in a quiet law library, a young student studying Carter's final opinions found a handwritten note tucked between the pages of an old legal brief. a line scribbled in the justice's handwriting. The measure of justice is not how it punishes the wicked, but how it protects the broken. It wasn't part of any official ruling, just a private thought, but perhaps that was the true conclusion of the story, the one no one ever read aloud. Because in the end, the case of Justice Harold Carter and Daniel Reeves was not just about death or law or guilt. It was about humanity, its fragility, its anger, and its endless, desperate search to make sense of itself. And though both men were gone, their story remained a reminder carved into history, that justice without mercy can destroy, and that mercy without truth can blind. Only when the two meet does healing truly begin,